Many resources to discover and understand this. My name is Loryn Blower, also known as White Turtle Warrior. I am from the Metis Nation. My ancestors are Lakota and Cree. I'm currently an environmental geography student here at SFU, so we're constantly bombarded with the horrible facts about our world and what we're living in right now. I'm also a board member of the First Nations Student Association and the Public Interest Research Group that's here at SFU. So from 9 to 19, I grew up in the Bahamas. It's a country of islands south of Florida. So I did not attend high school here. So I cannot speak personally to its ability to educate Canadian citizens. But what I can tell you, my friends, is from what I've learned of the people that I meet daily, is that there is a gross underrepresentation of First Nations learning in our high school education. Simply put, I am not impressed. When I investigated my heritage, it became apparent that people really do not know what's going on. This is one of the reasons we organized the event today, in order to educate our fellow citizens here at the university and beyond, in order to teach about the cultural assimilation and subjugation of First Nations individuals in Canada. We are I don't know more, and we want to know more. We also want others to know more. The outlook so far, from what I have seen, is not good. Every time I look deeper, it gets more and more upsetting. Just like a car crash, sometimes you just want to look away. I don't know if that explains why people are it's so hard for people to look further. I could not solve all the history, but I did want to share some of the things that I've learned coming back to Canada and rediscovering my ancestry. In 1763, King George III issued a royal proclamation that recognized Indian ownership of lands and their possessions and reserved to them all unceded land. It was made clear that Indian lands, though, could only be transferred to the Crown, that Aboriginal title is held as collective, and the Crown has a fiduciary responsibility for First Nations. This is where the relationship changed from sovereign nations to a nation of subjugation. The British North American Act was then passed in 1867 that ushered in legislative powers that marked the end of legally presumed First Nation sovereignty. The Indian Act was then created in 1876. It outlined the control and enforced cultural assimilation that still dominates First Nation people in Canada. I assure you, this act is alive, well, and just as racist as it once was. An act to further amend the Indian Act was passed in 1880. Section 3 amends the act to include the potlatch ban. This holds any person participating in the festival or encouraging of dance liable to 6 months in prison. So that's the people that participate in the ceremony and anybody encouraging said ceremonies. The potlatch is of particular importance to Pacific coastal people. It consists of many cultural practices and ceremonies, integral to socio-political activities. Banning the potlatch is a clear attempt to split established political structure in order to enact cultural assimilation. Think about how this would go over today. The law prohibits weddings, funerals, naming ceremonies, dancing, and religion. The law was not revived until 1951. That's only 62 years ago. In 1885, a pass system was introduced in which natives could not leave their reserve without permission from an Indian agent or farm instructor. It specified the purpose and duration. You must specify purpose, duration of the travel. This lasted as an informal practice until 1930. Does this sound familiar? In 1902, a commission from South Africa visited Canada to study the pass system to impose their own apartheid. The Indian Act, among many, defined a person as an individual other than an Indian. Under this act, Indigenous people became wards of the state. This means that the state is the person's legal guardian even in adulthood. Status Indians are still wards of the state. This means that under the state, status Indians are still wards of the state. We are still under colonial apartheid-style law. And for people that do not recognize this, you need to internalize this fact. It is racist, it is unacceptable, and it needs to change. many other pieces of information regarding the history and assimilation of my people has stunned me. Does anybody know this? Are we all living under a rock, sheltered by our own denial? Did this system of colonial assimilation work that well? It must be. People are still disgustingly racist. It may not be apparent in your day-to-day life. It may occur as the norm, and you may take it for granted. But if you take a look at the comment section on the news articles, it is quite revealing of people's true thoughts and nature. Journalist Marco Sejan, while on the Via Rail train that was stuck on the train from Montreal to Toronto, and the train was delayed by an, I don't know, more blockade. Yeah. He wrote down some of the comments that he overheard while he was on this train. A middle-aged mother observed, "The only reason they're out there is because they don't have jobs." Her husband offered a solution to end the blockade. "Just give them a bushel of tobacco," laughs, "and a box of glue," more laughs. A male student suggested, "If the train moves real slow, they'll have enough time to get out of the way and we can pass without running them over." His friend rhetorically said, "Why can't we run them over?" Maybe people who say that natives are lazy need to understand that in 1955, status Indians had their status enfranchised upon gaining a profession or a post-secondary degree. They could not remain on reserves and effectively support their communities with this education. Children, forcibly taken and segregated into residential schools, were taught a substandard education. Just enough education to assimilate them into dominant culture, but not enough to empower individuals to improve their political situation. Shame. The Canadian public seems to believe that First Nations people get free handouts, but I assure you, First Nations people have not been privileged after this contact. Natives don't pay taxes. Tax exemptions specifically only apply to status Indians who are doing work on the reserve or buying something on the reserve. The second the work involves transactions off the reserve, they are paying the same taxes as everybody else. Also, if they purchase things off the reserve, there is no tax exemption. If you look at Canada, do you really think that we can have the same, we don't live in a bubble in Canada, do we? Don't we need to rely on going to America and buying our goods, going to China overseas to sell our goods? How are First Nations supposed to live a tax-exempt life if they're stuck on a reserve and can't do anything off reserve? When subtracting children aged 0 to 14 from the tax base, this leaves only 272,000 First Nations people who even qualify for such exemptions. What is a reserve? One would hope it would be the land in which First Nations could exercise their unceded political, cultural, and economic autonomy, but the Indian Act still defines this reserve as a tract of land, the legal title to which is vested in Her Majesty, that has been set apart by Her Majesty for the use and benefit of a band. Few reserves have economic advantages in which they would gain large non-taxable revenues, and if they have economic advantages, these are held in trust by the Minister of Indian Affairs, who gets to stay as long as he wants in this position under the Queen's pleasure. What Canadians must understand is this is a civil rights issue. It is an issue of apartheid, legal legislated racism and subjugation. There will be a right side of history and there will be a wrong side. Racist, stereotypical, bigoted commentary will be the wrong side of history. Please put this in perspective with American black civil rights. The segregation of people based on race is unacceptable no matter where it is globally. First Nations need to be autonomous in order to control their own lands and resources and be chartered their own membership and their own destiny, not under a patriarchal, babysitting, enforcing status, non-status system. This I Don't Know More movement, which will continue, is a push for civil human rights under the Constitution of Canada. Just the same as the civil rights movement in America, this is our own civil rights movement. It needs to be respected as such. First Nations deserve our own land in which we can be respected as the equal founders of this country. First Nations deserve constitutional rights to protect their autonomy and respect their civilization, their way of life, and their right to govern themselves. If this social individuals. Their herds were slaughtered in order to leave the First Nations with no food source and no way of life. Systematically slaughtered. If you don't feel there's a need to support First Nations, then support the bison that were destroyed alongside them.
Or the salmon and the herring now.
Support the salmon. Support the environment. Support the people that need the land, because we all need this land. Please try to understand the ties that First Nations have with this land, the rights to the water, the air, the forest, and the non-human animals. All my relations. I don't know more.
Thank you, Loryn. And so I'd like